October 15, 1963. The black Cadillac pulled up to the Corktown boarding house at exactly 2:17 a.m. Three men in suits stepped out. They weren't FBI. Hoover's brother Thomas answered the door in his bathrobe. His sister Dorothy stood behind him, clutching a coffee cup. They'd been expecting this visit for weeks. "Mr. Hoover," the tall man said, "your brother sent us." What happened next would stay buried in FBI files for 60 years. The Detroit police received orders to stand down. Federal agents were reassigned, and for 7 days the most powerful man in America pretended his own siblings didn't exist. But someone was watching. Someone was recording. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would reveal that the most dangerous criminals in America weren't the ones wearing masks. They were the ones wearing badges. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. The unmarked surveillance van parked 3 blocks from the boarding house shook as Special Agent Margaret Cross slammed her fist against the dashboard. The radio crackled with static before Agent Sullivan's voice cut through. "All units, stand down. Repeat, all units, stand down." "Stand down?" Maggie grabbed the radio, her knuckles white. "Sullivan, we have eyes on a federal crime in progress. 3 armed suspects just entered." "Cross, you heard the order. Pack it up." Through her telephoto lens, Maggie watched the boarding house windows flicker with movement. Shadows danced behind thin curtains. Thomas Hoover's bathrobe lay crumpled on the front porch steps. The coffee cup Dorothy had been holding was shattered across the walkway, dark liquid seeping between the cracks in the concrete. Maggie's partner, Agent Ray Kowalski, pulled off his headphones and turned to face her. 23 years old and still believing the Bureau was infallible, his face showed the confusion she'd felt herself just moments ago. "What's happening here, Maggie? We've been tracking the Rousseau organization for 8 months. This is our break." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because the truth was crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on a winter lake, and she didn't want to believe what she was seeing. The tall man who'd spoken to Thomas Hoover emerged from the house first. Even in the grainy green glow of her night vision scope, Maggie recognized him. Vincent Rousseau, head of Detroit's Black Mafia, the same man whose photograph had been pinned to their operation board for months, the same man they'd been ordered to arrest on sight. He was smiling. Behind him, 2 other figures struggled with what looked like laundry bundles. But laundry didn't wear shoes. Laundry didn't have arms that hung limp and lifeless. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski whispered. "Are those—" "Get the camera," Maggie snapped. "Document everything. But the stand-down order, Ray, if you don't pick up that camera right now, I'm going to throw you out of this van and drive over your body twice." Kowalski's hands trembled as he adjusted the telephoto lens. The click-whir of the camera motor seemed deafeningly loud in the confined space. Through the scope, Maggie watched Rousseau check his watch with the casual precision of a man keeping a schedule. Not the desperate urgency of a kidnapper, the methodical timing of someone following orders. The radio crackled again. Cross, Kowalski, returned to headquarters immediately for debriefing. Maggie stared at the radio as if it had just spoken in a foreign language. In her 7 years with the Bureau, she'd never been recalled from an active surveillance operation. Not once. Federal agents didn't get pulled back when civilians were in danger. They got reinforcements. "Base, this is Cross. We have visual confirmation of the Hoover siblings being removed from their residence under duress. Request immediate tactical support." Silence. Long enough for Maggie to count her own heartbeat. Then, "Negative. Return to base. That's a direct order from Deputy Director Sullivan." Kowalski lowered the camera. "Sullivan's not even our direct supervisor. Why is he—" The question died in his throat as they both realized what it meant. Orders coming from above their pay grade. Way above. Maggie grabbed the ignition keys, but her hand froze halfway to the engine. Through the scope, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The black Cadillac's rear window was down, and Thomas Hoover was sitting upright in the back seat, very much alive, very much conscious. He was talking to Rousseau like they were old friends. "Son of a bitch," she breathed. "It's not a kidnapping." "What?" Maggie's mind raced through the possibilities. each one worse than the last. Look at the body language. Look at how they're standing. Thomas isn't resisting. Dorothy isn't screaming for help. The Cadillac pulled away from the curb with the kind of smooth acceleration that suggested no urgency whatsoever. No squealing tires, no desperate escape. Just 3 men and 2 cooperative passengers disappearing into the Detroit night like they'd done this a dozen times before. Maggie started the van and followed at a distance, ignoring Kowalski's protests about direct orders and career suicide. The Cadillac made 4 stops over the next hour. Each stop lasted exactly 7 minutes. At each location, one of Rousseau's men got out and handed an envelope to someone waiting in the shadows. Payoffs, or instructions, or both. When the Cadillac finally pulled into the warehouse district near the Detroit River, Maggie parked behind an abandoned factory and killed the engine. The building they'd entered bore no markings, no signs of life except for a single light in a third-floor window. "We're calling this in," Kowalski said, reaching for the radio. Maggie caught his wrist. "Who are we calling?" "Sullivan already ordered us to stand down. The Detroit PD has been told to stay away. So who exactly do you think is going to believe that J. Edgar Hoover's brother just willingly got into a car with the most wanted criminal in Michigan?" The weight of what she was suggesting settled between them like a third passenger in the van. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of cargo ships moving along the Detroit River. Maggie stared at the unmarked warehouse, its brick facade black against the November sky, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not fear. She'd lived with fear since her first day at the Bureau. This was different. This was the feeling of watching the ground open up beneath everything she'd built her life on. "Maybe there's an explanation," Kowalski said finally, but his voice carried no conviction. He was 23, fresh from Quantico, still young enough to believe the system worked the way they taught it in training manuals. Maggie envied him that innocence, even as she watched it crumble in real time. She pulled out her notebook and began writing, the pen scratching against paper in neat, precise strokes. Timestamps, license plate numbers, the exact sequence of stops they'd witnessed, the 7-minute intervals that suggested choreography, not chaos. "What are you doing?" "My job." She didn't look up from the page. "Someone's going to want answers tomorrow, or next week, or when this whole thing falls apart." Through the van's dirty windshield, Detroit spread out before them like a patient on an operating table. The city had been bleeding jobs and people for years, leaving behind empty factories and abandoned neighborhoods that made perfect hiding places for men like Vincent Rousseau. But tonight, Maggie was beginning to understand that the real hiding was happening in places far more respectable than abandoned warehouses. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the photograph on her desk back at the field office. Sarah, age 4, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the yellow sundress her grandmother had sewn by hand. The picture had been taken 3 months ago at Belle Isle Park, during one of their rare Sunday afternoons together. Maggie had been working the Rousseau case 6 days a week, coming home after Sarah's bedtime more often than not, trying to justify the long hours by telling herself she was making the world safer for her daughter. Now she wondered what kind of world she'd actually been protecting. "Maggie," Kowalski's voice was tight, "that light just went out." She looked up from her notebook to see the warehouse had gone completely dark. No movement, no sound. Just the November wind rattling loose shutters and carrying the smell of rust and river water through the van's cracked windows. "How long?" "Maybe 10 minutes. You think they're gone?" Maggie considered this. The building had only one visible entrance, a loading dock that would require them to cross 50 yards of open ground. If Rousseau had lookouts, and he always had lookouts, they'd be spotted before they got halfway there. But the alternative was sitting in the van until morning, and by then, whatever was happening in that warehouse would be finished. She thought about Thomas Hoover's casual conversation with Rousseau, about Dorothy's lack of resistance, about the 7-minute stops and the envelopes passed in shadows. "They're not gone," she said finally. "They just don't want to be seen anymore." The radio crackled to life again, making them both jump. "All units, be advised. Agent Cross and Agent Kowalski are to return to headquarters immediately. Direct order from Washington. Washington, not Detroit field office, not regional headquarters. Washington." Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. In her 7 years with the Bureau, she'd never heard of a surveillance team being recalled by Washington. Local supervisors made those decisions, unless someone very high up the chain had a very good reason to pull them back, or unless someone very high up the chain had something very important to hide. She started the engine, but instead of heading back toward the city center, she made a U-turn and drove deeper into the warehouse district. Behind them, the river reflected the lights of Windsor across the water, a reminder that the border was less than a mile away. Close enough for people to disappear if they needed to. Close enough for problems to be solved quietly, without messy federal investigations or newspaper headlines. "Where are we going?" Kowalski asked. Maggie didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about Sarah again, about the bedtime stories she'd promised to read but hadn't, about the bicycle lessons she'd postponed because of surveillance shifts and case files, about the kind of mother you became when you spent your days chasing shadows and your nights wondering which of your colleagues you could actually trust. "Home," she said finally. "We're going home." But even as she said it, Maggie knew that whatever home had meant 3 hours ago, it would mean something different now. The ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure it would ever feel solid again. The warehouse disappeared in her rearview mirror, but the single dark window seemed to follow her, reflecting off every surface she passed, a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Chapter 3, Inciting Incident. Maggie's house on Elmwood Street looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White clapboard siding, blue shutters, the porch light casting its familiar yellow glow across the front steps. But as she pulled into the driveway, everything felt foreign, like she was seeing a movie set designed to look like her life. Kowalski hadn't spoken during the 20-minute drive from the warehouse district. Now he sat in the passenger seat staring at the dashboard, probably wondering if his career was over before it had really begun. Maggie wondered the same thing about her own. "Ray, go home. Don't write a report tonight. Don't call Sullivan. Don't do anything until I figure out what we're dealing with." He nodded, got out, and walked to his own car without looking back. Maggie watched his taillights disappear around the corner before she finally killed the engine. The babysitter, Mrs. Chen from next door, met her at the front door with a concerned expression. "Sarah asked for you 3 times. I told her you were working, but she's been having trouble sleeping." Maggie paid her and watched the older woman cross the yard to her own house, carrying with her the last remnant of normalcy from this day. Inside, the house felt too quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with metronomic precision, counting out seconds that felt different now, weighted with knowledge she didn't want to carry. She climbed the stairs to Sarah's room and found her daughter curled under a quilt decorated with dancing bears. 4 years old, all dark curls and stubborn chin, a chin that looked exactly like her father's had, back when David was still alive, back when Maggie thought she understood how the world worked. Sarah's eyes opened as Maggie sat on the edge of the bed. "Mommy, you smell funny." "Funny how?" "Like scared." Children noticed everything. Maggie had forgotten that, or maybe she'd been too distracted by case files and surveillance reports to remember. She smoothed Sarah's hair and tried to smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Sarah was already drifting off again, secure in the belief that her mother would keep the world safe and predictable. Maggie stayed until her daughter's breathing deepened, then went downstairs to the kitchen. She was reaching for the coffee tin when she saw it, an envelope on the kitchen table, cream-colored paper, no postmark. Her name written across the front in careful block letters, Agent Margaret Cross. Maggie's hand froze halfway to the coffee tin. She lived alone with Sarah. Mrs. Chen had her own key for emergencies, but she would never open mail or leave mysterious envelopes on kitchen tables. The back door was still locked, deadbolt turned, exactly as she'd left it that morning. Someone had been inside her house. She drew her service weapon before approaching the table, though she knew whoever had left the envelope was long gone. They'd wanted to send a message, not a confrontation. The paper felt expensive between her fingers, the kind used for wedding invitations or legal documents. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed her and Kowalski in the surveillance van, taken through the passenger window with a telephoto lens. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., exactly when they'd been watching the warehouse, exactly when she'd thought they were the ones doing the watching. The note was worse than the photograph. Agent Cross, your dedication to justice is admirable, but some truths are more dangerous than the lies they replace. Your daughter is beautiful. The yellow dress suits her perfectly. We hope she continues to sleep peacefully. Maggie's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the kitchen chair, the note trembling in her hands. They knew about the surveillance. They knew about the photograph on her desk at work. They knew about Sarah's yellow dress from Belle Isle Park, and they'd been inside her house. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a blade. Maggie stared at it for 4 rings before answering. Agent Cross. The voice was unfamiliar, professionally neutral. I trust you found our message illuminating. Who is this? Someone who understands that you've seen things tonight that could complicate an already delicate situation. The Hoover matter requires careful handling. The Hoover matter? Maggie's voice came out sharper than she intended. You mean the kidnapping we witnessed? A pause. Then, almost gently, Agent Cross, there was no kidnapping. Thomas and Dorothy Hoover are exactly where they need to be, doing exactly what they need to do. Your surveillance operation encountered a family reunion, nothing more. Bullshit. The word escaped before she could stop it. You saw what you expected to see. And tomorrow, you'll file a report stating that the subjects left voluntarily with known associates. The Detroit PD will close their missing persons inquiry. The Bureau will classify this as a domestic matter outside federal jurisdiction. Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. And if I don't? Agent Cross, your daughter is 4 years old. She has her whole life ahead of her. Ballet lessons, birthday parties, first days of school. It would be tragic if circumstances prevented her from experiencing those milestones. The line went dead. Maggie sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar detritus of ordinary life. Sarah's drawings taped to the refrigerator, dirty dishes in the sink, a half-finished grocery list stuck to the wall, and felt the last vestiges of her old world crumble away. Whatever had happened in that warehouse tonight, it was bigger than Vincent Rousseau, bigger than the Detroit Black Mafia, and now her daughter was part of it. The yellow porch light flickered once and went out, leaving only darkness pressing against the kitchen windows. Chapter 4, Early Development. Maggie sat in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, listening to the house settle around her. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, then half past, each sound making her flinch. When Sarah's footsteps creaked overhead, bathroom visit, back to bed, Maggie's hand moved to her weapon before she recognized the familiar pattern. This was how it would be now. Every sound a threat, every shadow a question mark. She tried calling her supervisor first, then remembered Sullivan's name on the radio recall. So she tried Janet Morrison instead, her academy roommate, now working domestic terrorism out of the Chicago field office. Someone outside the immediate circle. Someone she could trust. Maggie? Christ, it's almost 1 a.m. Jan, I need to ask you something. Hypothetically. Maggie kept her voice low, aware that sound carried differently in darkness. If you witnessed something involving a federal operation, but your chain of command told you to pretend it never happened, what would you do? A long pause. Janet had always been careful, methodical. It's why she'd risen faster through the ranks than most of their academy class. Hypothetically, I'd remember that I have a mortgage and a pension to protect. Another pause. Maggie, what kind of trouble are you in? I'm not sure yet. Then here's some free advice. Be sure before you do anything stupid. The Bureau protects its own, but only if its own follow the rules. The line went quiet except for static. Then Janet's voice came back, softer now. Whatever you think you saw, there are people way above our pay grade who probably have very good reasons for handling it the way they're handling it. Don't be the agent who thinks she knows better than the system. After Janet hung up, Maggie called Ray Kowalski. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again an hour later. Still voicemail. At 3 a.m., she drove to his apartment building on Grand River Avenue. The 1963 Buick he was so proud of sat in its usual spot, but his windows were dark. She climbed to the 3rd floor and knocked. No answer. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and old cigarettes, and the silence felt wrong. Kowalski was a light sleeper. Bureau training made most of them that way. Mrs. Kowalski answered on the fourth knock, peering through the chain-locked door with eyes that looked like she'd been crying. "He's not here," she said quickly. "Ray got reassigned. Emergency transfer. He left 2 hours ago." "Reassigned where?" The older woman's face crumpled. "I don't know. They said it was classified. They said he couldn't tell anyone, not even family." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What did you two get into, Agent Cross? What kind of trouble is my boy in?" Maggie drove home with her rearview mirror full of questions. Emergency transfers didn't happen at midnight unless someone wanted an agent very far away, very quickly. And they certainly didn't happen without paperwork, without proper notice, without the transferred agent being able to explain anything to his own mother. Back home, she tried to sleep but gave up after an hour of staring at the ceiling. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote everything down, every detail from the warehouse, every stop the Cadillac had made, every word of the threatening phone call. She used her personal notepad, not bureau paperwork, and hid the pages inside an old cookbook. When Sarah came downstairs for breakfast, Maggie had coffee made and eggs ready, playing the part of a normal mother having a normal morning. But her daughter's questions felt different now. "Why are you home, Mommy? You're never home for breakfast. I wanted to see you before school. Are we in trouble?" The question hit like a physical blow. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah shrugged, concentrating on her scrambled eggs. "Mrs. Chen said men came asking about you yesterday, after you left for work but before you came home." Maggie's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "What kind of men?" "She said they looked like policemen but weren't wearing uniforms. They wanted to know about our family, about Daddy. David had been dead for 2 years. Heart attack at 31, no warning, no time for goodbyes. What possible interest could anyone have in a dead insurance adjuster? Unless they were looking for pressure points, weaknesses, ways to hurt her through the people she loved." When she called the field office at 9, Deputy Director Sullivan's secretary informed her that she'd been placed on administrative leave pending review of her performance during the previous evening's operation. "What review? What operation?" Maggie asked. "According to your people, nothing happened last night. Agent Cross, I'd suggest you use this time to reflect on the importance of following direct orders. Your review hearing is scheduled for Friday. 3 days. They were giving her 3 days to decide whether to stay quiet or destroy her career. That afternoon, she picked Sarah up from school early and drove to her sister's house in Ann Arbor. Ellen asked too many questions, but she agreed to keep Sarah for the weekend, just in case Mommy has to work. Driving back to Detroit alone, Maggie realized that everyone who might have supported her, Kowalski, Janet, even Ellen, had found reasons to step away. Not because they didn't care, but because they recognized something she was still learning to see. Some truths were too dangerous to touch, even for people whose job was finding truth. The setting sun turned her windshield into a mirror, and for a moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Chapter 5, Middle Development. The woman in the windshield mirror had hollow eyes and lines that hadn't been there a week ago. Maggie pulled into a roadside diner outside Ann Arbor, needing time to think before returning to Detroit. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few truckers and the kind of people who found themselves on forgotten highways after dark. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over red vinyl booths, and a counter that had seen better decades. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, brought coffee without being asked. Maggie wrapped her hands around the cup and tried to make sense of what was happening to her life. The diner's payphone hung on the wall near the restroom, and after 20 minutes of coffee and circular thoughts, she walked over and dialed a number she'd memorized but never used. "Records Division, this is Martinez. This is Agent Cross, Detroit Field Office. I need a background check on Thomas and Dorothy Hoover. Personal information, family connections, anything in the files." A pause. "Agent Cross, I show you're currently on administrative leave. I can't process that request without proper authorization. Since when do records checks require?" "Since this morning. New directive from Washington. All requests involving the Hoover family require deputy director level approval." Martinez's voice softened. "Sorry, Margaret, my hands are tied. The Hoover family. Not just Thomas and Dorothy, the entire family. As if someone had anticipated exactly the kind of questions she'd be asking. Back at her booth, Maggie stared out the window at the highway and felt the weight of 15 years' worth of buried doubts. Every case that had been quietly reassigned, every investigation that had stopped just short of answers, every time she'd been told to trust the system, trust the chain of command, trust that someone higher up knew what was best. She'd always told herself those decisions made sense, that there were complexities beyond her clearance level, strategies she wasn't qualified to understand. But now, with the taste of real corruption sharp in her mouth, those old rationalizations felt like lies she'd chosen to believe. The waitress refilled her cup. "You look like someone who's seen something she wishes she hadn't." Maggie looked up, surprised by the observation. The woman's name tag read Dolores, and her eyes held the kind of knowing that came from decades of watching people run from their problems. "What makes you say that?" "Honey, I've been working this highway for 23 years. You see all kinds, people running to something, people running from something. You got the look of someone who found out the good guys aren't as good as she thought." The accuracy of it stung. Maggie had built her identity around being one of the good guys, around believing that justice mattered more than politics or convenience. Now she was sitting in a roadside diner, afraid to go home to her own house, watching her career disintegrate because she'd witnessed something she was supposed to pretend didn't exist. "What would you do?" Maggie asked. "If you knew something terrible was happening, but telling the truth would destroy everything you'd worked for?" Dolores wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency. "Depends what kind of terrible we're talking about, and depends what kind of person you are when nobody's watching." She paused, looking directly at Maggie. "But I'll tell you this, I've seen a lot of people choose the safe road, and most of them spend the rest of their lives wondering what would have happened if they'd been brave." After Dolores walked away, Maggie sat alone with questions that felt like wounds. She thought about Sarah's innocent trust, about the life she'd built as a federal agent, about the pension and security that administrative cooperation would preserve. Then she thought about Thomas Hoover's terrified eyes and Dorothy's silent resignation, about the envelope in her kitchen and the men asking questions about her dead husband. At 9 p.m., she finally drove back toward Detroit. But instead of going home, she parked across from the warehouse district and walked the streets where everything had started. The loading docks stood empty, no trace of the previous night's events, no police tape, no evidence markers, no sign that anything unusual had ever happened here. It was as if the kidnapping had been surgically removed from reality. Standing in the shadows where she'd first seen Vincent Rousseau, Maggie made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't unknow what she knew, couldn't unsee what she'd witnessed. And if staying silent meant becoming complicit in whatever had required Thomas Hoover to disappear, then she'd already lost everything that mattered about who she was. The warehouse district stretched around her like a graveyard of abandoned possibilities. Tomorrow, she would go to her review hearing. But tonight, she would document everything, not just for the Bureau but for history, for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. The wind off the river carried the smell of decay and old secrets, and Maggie walked back to her car knowing she'd already crossed a line she could never uncross. Chapter 6, Plot Twist. Maggie drove through empty streets toward home, her decision crystallizing with each mile. Document everything. Force them to deal with facts instead of convenient silence. The weight of it felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. Like stepping off a cliff she'd been circling for years. Her house sat dark against the November sky, porch light still burned out from the previous night. She parked in the driveway and walked to her front door, keys ready, when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The door was ajar, just an inch, but she'd checked the locks twice before leaving for Ann Arbor. Maggie drew her weapon and approached carefully, using the doorframe for cover. No sounds from inside. No movement behind the curtained windows. She pushed the door open with her foot and stepped into darkness that felt wrong, violated. They'd been thorough. Her living room had been turned inside out with surgical precision. Couch cushions sliced open, drawers emptied, even the family photos taken apart. But it was the kitchen that made her stomach clench. Every page of her hidden notes lay spread across the table like an accusation. The cookbook spine had been carefully reglued, but the evidence of her midnight documentation was gone. almost gone. On top of the scattered papers sat a manila folder she'd never seen before. Her name was typed across a white label, Margaret Cross, personal file. Inside, she found copies of documents that shouldn't have existed outside classified archives. Her husband's autopsy report, but not the version she'd been given. This one listed cause of death as acute cardiac distress following interrogation. There were photographs from the scene, showing David's body in what was clearly an office, not their bedroom where she'd found him. And there were transcripts of interviews. Someone had been asking her dead husband about her work, her cases, her access to bureau files. The medical examiner's signature was different too. Not Dr. Richardson, who had held her hand while explaining heart defects and genetic predispositions, but someone named Dr. Chen with credentials from a military pathology unit. David hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered, and she'd spent 2 years grieving a lie. The phone rang, cutting through her shock like a scream. This time, she recognized the voice immediately. Agent Cross, I trust you've reviewed the additional materials we left for you. You killed my husband. Her voice came out flat, emotionless. The rage would come later. Right now, there was only cold understanding. Your husband died because he couldn't accept the boundaries of his situation, much like you're struggling to accept yours now. What situation? What did David know that got him killed? A pause. Then, Agent Cross, your husband discovered that certain bureau operations require flexibility in their interpretation. He threatened to expose activities that serve essential national security interests. His death wasn't planned, but it became necessary when he refused to understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture. Maggie stared at the autopsy photos, at her husband's face frozen in what was clearly terror, not peaceful cardiac arrest. What activities? What was he going to expose? The same activities you witnessed 2 nights ago. Operations that sometimes require FBI resources to look the other way when certain organized crime elements serve our larger strategic goals. Your husband called it corruption. We call it practical intelligence work. Understanding hit like physical pain. The Bureau wasn't being manipulated by whatever had happened in that warehouse. They were orchestrating it. The kidnapping, the silence, the systematic removal of anyone who might ask questions. This wasn't corruption, this was policy. Vincent Rousseau works for you, she said. Agent Cross, Vincent Rousseau works for America. The information his organization provides about communist infiltration in Detroit's labor movement has prevented 3 potential strikes and identified 17 suspected foreign agents. If maintaining that intelligence source requires us to ignore certain domestic disputes within the Hoover family, that's a price we're willing to pay. Domestic disputes? The euphemism was obscene. I saw them dragged out of that warehouse. You saw a director's estranged siblings being reminded of their obligations to family privacy. Nothing more, nothing less. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. J. Edgar Hoover's siblings weren't random kidnapping victims. They were leverage. And the Bureau wasn't investigating their disappearance because the Bureau had arranged it. How long? Maggie asked. How long have you been protecting criminals to serve your investigations? Agent Cross, we don't protect criminals. We utilize assets. Sometimes those assets require management techniques that appear unorthodox to field agents with limited perspective. As if witnessing government-sanctioned kidnapping was a failure of imagination rather than a fundamental violation of everything the Bureau claimed to represent. Maggie hung up and stood in her destroyed kitchen, surrounded by evidence of 15 years' worth of lies. Every case she'd worked, every arrest she'd made, every conviction she'd celebrated. All of it built on a foundation of managed corruption and strategic blindness. The yellow porch light flickered back on, casting everything in sickly illumination. Outside, a car engine started somewhere down the block. They were still watching, still waiting to see whether she'd learned to accept her boundaries, the way David never had. Chapter 7. Climax build up. The car engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt like held breath. Maggie stood among the ruins of her kitchen, David's real autopsy photos scattered at her feet like accusations she'd been too blind to read for 2 years. The yellow porch light painted everything the color of old bruises. She had maybe an hour before they came back, maybe less. Moving with practiced efficiency, she gathered the documents they'd left behind, not to hide them, but to study them. If they'd wanted her to see David's real death photos, it was because they believed those images would break her the way they'd broken him. They were wrong. The shock was already crystallizing into something harder, more dangerous. Purpose. Her personal phone rang, not the bureau line, her home number that only family knew. She almost didn't answer, but Ellen's voice on the machine made her grab the receiver. Maggie? Jesus, Maggie. Pick up if you're there. I'm here. Is Sarah? Sarah's fine. She's asleep. But Maggie, someone came to my house an hour ago. 2 men in suits asking questions about you, about David, about whether you'd brought any work materials with you today. The walls seemed to close in. They weren't just watching anymore. They were expanding the circle, pulling in anyone who might offer shelter. What did you tell them? That you were having a rough time at work and needed space to think. But Maggie, they knew things. About David's death, about your cases, about Sarah's school schedule. Ellen's voice dropped to a whisper. They knew I call you every Thursday at 7. How could they know that? Phone taps, mail surveillance, probably months of it, building a complete picture of every relationship, every vulnerability, every pressure point they could use. The realization should have been paralyzing. Instead, it felt liberating. If they were this thorough, this systematic, then David's death wasn't some tragic accident she could have prevented. It was an execution, planned and carried out by people who had been watching them long before that warehouse ever appeared in her life. Ellen, listen to me carefully. Pack a bag for you and Sarah. Drive to Mom's place in Toledo. Don't call ahead, just go. Stay there until I contact you. Maggie, you're scaring me. What's happening? The question hung between them like a bridge Maggie couldn't cross without burning everything behind her. How do you tell your sister that the government killed your husband? That the bureau you've served for 15 years orchestrates kidnappings and calls them intelligence operations? That every assumption about justice and law enforcement has been systematically dismantled in the space of 3 days? I found out some things about David's death. Things that mean Sarah isn't safe while I'm asking questions. Ellen's silence stretched long enough that Maggie wondered if the line had been cut. Then, the men who came tonight, they mentioned David, said his death was a tragedy that didn't need to be repeated. Another pause. Maggie, what did they do to him? They killed him. And they'll kill me too if I don't stop looking for answers. The words hung in the air like a confession she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Every doctor's explanation she'd accepted, every sympathy card she'd received, every night she'd blamed herself for not recognizing his stress symptoms, all of it built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. Then stop, Ellen said simply. Whatever questions you're asking, stop asking them. Come to Toledo with us. We'll figure out something else, somewhere else. Running. The smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would keep Sarah alive and Ellen untouchable. Take her daughter and disappear into the kind of ordinary life where federal agents don't orchestrate kidnappings and dead husbands stay properly buried. But David had tried running, had tried to accept the boundaries of his situation, to understand the bigger picture, to find some accommodation with the truth he'd stumbled across. And they'd killed him anyway, because some secrets were too dangerous to trust to even the most cooperative witness. I can't, Maggie said. If I run now, they'll always know where to find us. The only way to keep Sarah safe is to make sure the truth gets out. Make it too expensive for them to keep killing people. And if you're wrong, if they kill you before you can tell anyone? Through her kitchen window, Maggie could see the warehouse district in the distance, its loading docks and empty buildings holding secrets that had already cost too many lives. Thomas and Dorothy Hoover were still missing, probably dead. Ray Kowalski had disappeared into emergency reassignment. Her husband had been murdered for asking inconvenient questions. How many others had been silenced to protect operations that required strategic blindness? Then at least Sarah will know her father died fighting something worth fighting, Maggie said, instead of thinking he died of a weak heart and bad genetics. After Ellen hung up, promising to leave immediately, to keep Sarah safe, to call their mother's neighbor if anything seemed wrong, Maggie sat alone in her violated kitchen and made the final preparations. Not for survival, but for truth. She had David's real autopsy report, proof of Bureau surveillance, documented evidence of government-sanctioned crimes. But she needed more. She needed the whole story. Who Thomas and Dorothy Hoover really were, why they'd been taken, what secrets were worth orchestrating their disappearance. And she knew exactly where to find those answers. The Detroit FBI field office stood empty at midnight, its windows dark except for the security lighting that cast harsh shadows across the parking garage. Maggie used her keycard one last time, knowing the electronic record would mark the exact moment she chose truth over survival. The elevator carried her to the 7th floor, where classified files lived behind locks she still had access to for exactly 7 more hours. Her review hearing was scheduled for 8 a.m. After that, her badge would be confiscated and her clearance revoked. But right now, at this moment suspended between her old life and whatever came next, she remained Agent Margaret Cross with full investigative privileges. The Hoover family files occupied an entire cabinet in the restricted archive. Not J. Edgar's official records, those lived in Washington under security she could never breach. These were the family files, the genealogical research and background investigations that predated his appointment as director, files that should have been routine bureaucratic housekeeping, except they were classified above her pay grade and locked behind protocols reserved for active national security cases. Her access code still worked. The system logged her entry with mechanical indifference, Cross, Margaret, 0473, Hoover Family Archive, full access authorized. The first folder contained birth certificates, property records, immigration documents dating back to 1895. J. Edgar Hoover's father, Dickerson Naylor Hoover Sr., had made his fortune in real estate and municipal contracts throughout the Southeast in the early 1900s. But the contracts weren't for schools or hospitals. They were for courthouse construction, jail expansions, and something called population management infrastructure in 17 counties across Mississippi and Alabama. Maggie opened the second folder and found photographs that made her stomach clench. Construction sites showing groups of black men in chains, building the very courthouses where they would later be tried. Contracts detailing payment structures based on processing efficiency and resolution volume. Letters from local officials praising Dickerson Hoover's ability to maintain order during periods of social adjustment. The Hoover family fortune was built on the systematic construction of lynching infrastructure. Jails designed for maximum intimidation, courthouse squares engineered for public executions, municipal buildings positioned to facilitate crowd control during what the documents euphemistically called community justice events. And Thomas and Dorothy Hoover had known, more than known, they had evidence. The third folder contained a letter dated November 15, 1963, 3 days before their disappearance. Thomas's handwriting was careful, measured, the script of someone who understood he was documenting something that might get him killed. Edgar refuses to see reason. We have father's correspondence with the Birmingham officials, the payment records, the architectural plans. Dorothy found the photographs in mother's effects, actual documentation of hangings, with father's buildings in the background. We cannot remain silent while Edgar uses bureau resources to protect our family's reputation. Some sins are too large for family loyalty. We have contacted the Washington Post. They are interested in a story about FBI leadership and historical involvement in racial violence. The meeting is scheduled for December 1st. Edgar knows he has made threats, but we cannot unsee what we have seen. If something happens to us, the documents are hidden with Margaret Sanger in Detroit. She promised to keep them safe, promised to make sure the truth survives even if we do not. Margaret Sanger, the civil rights activist who had been found dead in her apartment 2 weeks after Thomas and Dorothy disappeared, her death attributed to a heart attack, despite being 34 years old and in perfect health. Maggie photographed everything with the small camera she'd brought, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was documenting. J. Edgar Hoover hadn't just orchestrated his siblings' kidnapping to protect family secrets. He had used FBI resources to cover up his father's role in constructing the infrastructure of Southern terrorism. And when Thomas and Dorothy threatened to expose that history, he had authorized their elimination. Vincent Rousseau's organized crime operation was a bureau front. The warehouse district meetings, the staged kidnapping, the systematic silence from local law enforcement. All of it designed to provide plausible cover for the disappearance of witnesses who threatened the director's carefully constructed public image. The phone on the archive desk rang, its sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet building. Maggie stared at it, knowing that answering would mean confrontation, but silence would mean they knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. She picked up on the fourth ring. Agent Cross. The voice belonged to Director Hoover himself, calling from Washington at 1 a.m. to speak with the field agent whose questions had finally reached too close to home. "I understand you've been doing some late-night research." "I know what your father did," Maggie said. "I know why Thomas and Dorothy had to disappear. I know why my husband was murdered." The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. Then, quietly, Agent Cross, "My father built America. Sometimes building requires difficult choices. Your father built death chambers, and you killed your own family to hide it." "The truth," Hoover said, his voice carrying the weight of decades in power, "is that some foundations are too important to excavate, Agent Cross, even if they rest on difficult ground." The line went dead, leaving Maggie alone with the documents that had cost so many lives. She sat in the archive's fluorescent silence, surrounded by evidence that would destroy the Bureau's reputation and expose the systematic murder of American citizens by their own government. Evidence that would also ensure her death within hours of its publication. But Sarah was safe in Toledo. Ellen would keep her away from Detroit, away from the reach of men who orchestrated kidnappings and called them intelligence operations. Whatever happened next, her daughter would grow up knowing her father died fighting for truth rather than succumbing to genetic weakness. Maggie finished photographing the files, then carefully returned everything to its proper order. Let them wonder what she'd seen, what she'd copied, what weapons she now carried into the final confrontation. The not knowing would eat at them the way uncertainty had consumed her for 2 years. The elevator carried her down through 15 years of service, past floors where she'd worked cases and celebrated arrests and believed in justice. The lobby's marble echoed with her footsteps as she walked toward doors that would close behind her forever. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in December, Agent Margaret Cross left the Detroit FBI field office for the last time. Dawn was still hours away when she reached the Detroit Free Press building. Night security recognized her badge and escorted her to the newsroom, where a skeleton crew of editors worked under deadline pressure. She asked for the senior investigative reporter and waited in a conference room that smelled of coffee and cigarettes and the particular urgency that newspaper buildings held a deadline. James Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, a man in his 50s whose reputation for government accountability had made him dangerous to federal agencies across Michigan. He listened without interruption as she laid out the evidence, watched without comment as she spread photographs across the conference table like tarot cards predicting institutional collapse. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her face rather than the documents. "Agent Cross, if I publish this story, you understand what will happen to you. They've already decided what will happen to me. This just determines whether it means anything." Morrison nodded slowly, then began gathering the photographs. "We'll run it tomorrow. Front page, full investigation. I'll need you available for follow-up questions." "I might not be available," Maggie said, "but everything you need is in those files." She drove home through Detroit's empty streets, past the warehouse district where it all began, past the neighborhoods where families slept unaware that their government orchestrated kidnappings and eliminated inconvenient witnesses. The yellow porch light was off when she pulled into her driveway, the house dark and silent as a held breath. Inside, she found them waiting. Not Hoover's men this time, but Vincent Rousseau himself, sitting in David's chair like a visiting dignitary. 2 others flanked the living room entrance, their presence more suggestion than threat. "Agent Cross." Rousseau's voice carried the same measured tone she remembered from that night at the warehouse. "I trust your research has been illuminating. Illuminating enough." She remained standing, keys still in her hand. "I know what you are. I know who you work for. And what am I, Agent Cross? A federal asset. A bureau operation designed to provide cover for activities too dirty to acknowledge. You didn't kidnap the Hoover siblings. You disappeared them. On orders." Rousseau smiled, the expression holding neither warmth nor threat. The director values family privacy. Sometimes that privacy requires active protection from those who would exploit family difficulties for personal gain. Thomas and Dorothy Hoover weren't exploiting anything. They were trying to expose the truth about their father's business. Truth. Rousseau spoke the word like a diagnosis. Agent Cross, truth is a luxury that powerful men cannot always afford. Your husband never understood that distinction. The admission hung between them like a blade. David had discovered the Bureau's relationship with Rousseau's operation, had threatened to expose the systematic use of organized crime to achieve federal objectives. His death hadn't been punishment. It had been prophylaxis, preventing infection from spreading through the ranks. The Detroit Free Press will run the story tomorrow, Maggie said. Front page, everything about your operation, everything about Hoover's father, everything about Thomas and Dorothy. Your family privacy just became a public scandal. Rousseau's smile faded. Agent Cross, newspaper editors are remarkably susceptible to various forms of persuasion. Technical difficulties, legal challenges, unfortunate accidents. Publication is less certain than you imagine. But Maggie had prepared for that too. Copies of everything mailed to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. Insurance policies scattered across enough newsrooms to make suppression impossible. Morrison understood the stakes. By tomorrow evening, the story would exist in too many places to kill. You can't stop it, she said. All you can do is decide whether I live to see the aftermath. Rousseau stood slowly, his movements deliberate and final. Agent Cross, you've forced some very difficult decisions. Men in the director's position don't appreciate having their hand forced. The two flanking the entrance stepped forward, and Maggie understood that her choices had led to this moment in her living room, surrounded by the furniture she and David had chosen together, the books they'd read, the photographs documenting a life that had been built on foundations she'd never questioned. Will Sarah know the truth? She asked. Your daughter will know her mother died serving her country, Rousseau said. That will have to be enough. The morning newspapers would carry two stories. On the front page, a detailed investigation into FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's family history and the systematic elimination of witnesses who threatened to expose generational involvement in racial terrorism. On page 7, the tragic death of FBI agent Margaret Cross, killed in what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong, remembered by colleagues as a dedicated public servant who died protecting her family. Detroit police would classify the case as random violence, a break-in during which the perpetrators were surprised by the homeowner's unexpected return. No arrests would ever be made. The investigation would quietly close after 6 months, another unsolved tragedy in a city full of them. But Sarah Cross would grow up reading newspaper accounts of her mother's final case, understanding that some truths are worth dying for, that justice sometimes requires individual sacrifice to achieve institutional change. Ellen would keep the clippings in a scrapbook, ensuring that when Sarah was old enough to understand, she would know exactly who her parents had been and why their deaths mattered. The story ran for 6 weeks, spawning congressional hearings and internal investigations that would eventually force J. Edgar Hoover's resignation. Vincent Rousseau's operation was quietly dismantled, its assets reassigned to other federal priorities. Thomas and Dorothy Hoover's bodies were never found, but their evidence lived on in testimony that exposed decades of institutional corruption. In Toledo, a 9-year-old girl named Sarah Cross read newspaper stories about her mother's courage and began planning a career in journalism. She would spend her adult life investigating government accountability, following leads that honored the example of an FBI agent who chose truth over survival. Some foundations, once excavated, reveal bedrock strong enough to support something better. Margaret Cross never lived to see the Bureau rebuilt on that foundation, but her daughter did. And in the end, that was enough.